And now on Book TV, we want to introduce you to Wade Graham, who is the author of this book, among other books, American Eden. First of all, though, Wade Graham, what do you do for a living?
I do a series of things. I design gardens. I'm a professor of public policy, and I'm a journalist.
How did you get interested or active in the designing of gardens?
Like many things in life, I kind of fell sideways into it. I'd always been interested in cultural history, design, houses, landscape, things like that. And I got a chance early in life to actually train at the feet of a master, sort of taught me how to do it.
Who was that?
A woman named Nancy Gosley Power, who's based in Santa Monica. Quite a powerful designer. So what ended up happening to me was in these various strands of my life, designing gardens, thinking about cultural history, writing about environmental history, teaching about it, I realized that I was quite ignorant about what I was doing designing gardens. I knew how to do it. I could put an English garden with an English house, and I could put a modern garden with a modern house. But it struck me that I didn't know why we did these things, why people did these things. And it came to me quite strongly once, not only my ignorance, but that it was an interesting question. I had a woman client who said, I need your help. My husband has commissioned a Frank Gehry house, and it's very, very angular. It's got lots of sharp things sticking out like this and that. Would you please design me an English rose garden? And I thought, well, how am I going to do this, first of all? It poses some challenges. And second of all, what does it tell me about your marriage? So I set out to figure these things out.
What was the importance of the marriage in designing a garden?
The tensions between the two of them, trying to marry these two opposite styles, certainly were indicative of tensions deeper, who they were, how they tried to make things work. And it strikes me that anywhere you go, you see in the American landscape and American culture, you see unreconciled tensions. They're everywhere. Because we don't come from a unitary cultural tradition. We don't all think the same things. We bring bits of different things, just as we are bits of different things. We try to reconcile them. And those stories, the mismatches, are quite interesting.
Wade Graham, give us an example of a public space that's a tense place.
I think, to me, the most magical and productive and kind of curious and frustrating public space is probably Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's house and garden in Virginia. And it's a place I think everyone should go. It's absolutely stunning. It's a beautiful place. It's quite moving. It's quite whimsical. It's quite impressive. He really made an incredible sort of real estate demonstration there. And it's a place that, first of all, it's the founding American garden, really. We have to understand that Thomas Jefferson was born an Englishman in an English world. And it was up to him to fashion something new in the world, which was an American character. Did it mean to take English institutions and thoughts and ideas and turn them into something different, something that's American? So he did this at Monticello, and you see instantly that it's made of English parts and English fashion, but he did something different there. And the first thing one notices is this sort of, nowhere is there a straight line in Monticello. There are no clipped hedges. There are no parterres. There's no topiary. Because that, to him, the gardens that he grew up with were gardens about royal power. They were about oppression, absolutism, the King of France, and so forth. So he made Monticello with these wonderful curving lines and flower beds and woodlands that came up and views off into the distance to the mountains and the river below. And what he really did explicitly mean was that this was a free, democratic garden for a free and democratic people. So it's a demonstration, in a sense, of his ethics, of his ideology, of his aspiration and his belief for all of us. And yet it is completely unreconciled with the way in which he made a living. Namely, the garden was built by slaves.
Wade Graham, have public spaces always been important in American history?
Yeah, of course they've been enormously important, although America as a culture is far more turned inward. We're far more interested in our private spaces, so we don't often spend enough time worrying about public spaces, and we have probably fewer meaningful public spaces than other countries. We do have the mall in Washington, but it took a long time to actually get that fully together. We're still working on it, actually. We don't have the equivalent of Trafalgar Square or the Place de Concorde or Red Square or Tiananmen Square. We are a nation more concerned with private space, but I think that the distinction is not necessarily a meaningful one or a useful one when you look at gardens. So I make no distinction between a private garden or a hidden courtyard and something that's out there, a fairground or public space, as you say. I think they still are expressions of who we are, what we believe. They're windows into both the mind of the maker and the collective mind. So I look at gardens in a very promiscuous sense. Well, I look at a private garden that thinks of itself as a garden, but I'll also look at a golf course. I'll look at the way Jack Nicklaus carefully designed the fairways to look like the distance of the place where he was. So I think the key is to try to learn how to read the language of gardens in the way that we read other things that are more obvious, that are more explicitly expressive. So the landscape of, the language of gardens is it's water and it's grass and it's hedges and trees and woodlands and flower beds and fountains and so forth. But the syntax is similar to the way we put other things together, the way we express ourselves. So we do it through our dress, we do it through our speech, we do it through our politics. If we're wealthy, we do it by spending money on things to show people. It's a kind of form of demonstration. I try to read these things and get a window into the mind that made them. And in a sense, a garden, if I show it to you, is me putting my mind on the ground, putting it out there as a diagram, as a sort of diagram of who I think I should be, who I want to be, what I think utopia looks like. So that's how I approach it.
Who was Frederick Law Olmsted and his importance in America's public spaces?
Olmsted, I would say, created, with the help of an English architect named Calvert Vaux, who we forget to mention, I think the greatest piece of art of the American 19th century, and that's Central Park. And keep in mind that he was not trained to do this. He was trained as a gentleman farmer, and he failed at it. And then he was put in charge of the relief operations for wounded soldiers in the Civil War, American Sanitary Commission, which became the Red Cross. So he was someone skilled in organizing thousands of people and resources and so forth. And what they created there at Central Park is a kind of an incredible demonstration of what was going on in America at that time. So Central Park looks like nature, but it's a recreation of nature. It's a landscape scale replica of a nature that was being destroyed at the time that they built it. So Manhattan Island and New York City are this incredible raging conflagration of industrial and financial power, which quite scared Americans. Americans have been trained to think of ourselves as an agrarian people who live on farms in small towns. We have a sort of a virtue and simplicity, we are told, and we think of ourselves. And yet, in the 19th century, we're confronted with a very, very different reality, which was visible in places like New York City, which was enormous cities, industrialization, immigrants coming in by the tens of thousands, corruption and disease and war around us. Remember the Civil War? There's a kind of a wonderful moment in a Melville novel from 1852, which no one reads, called Pierre. There's a young country girl who Pierre brings to New York City, and she gazes at the endless avenues and the tall buildings, and she's anxious, and she says, "Thinkst thou, Pierre, that the time will come when all the earth shall be paved?" And indeed, that's what it felt like to people. It felt to Americans that we were paving the wilderness continent, which is in fact the thing that makes us different from the British, from the French, from everyone. It's the thing that guarantees our virtue. So in our act of destroying this nature as we marched across the continent, we became anxious at its destruction. And what Central Park represents is the kind of importation of a bit of nature into the middle of the city. And it's the thing that keeps people sane. In fact, Olmsted and Vaux talked about Central Park not in aesthetic terms at all, even though it's this gorgeous place with this sort of wild seeming landscapes and lakes and forests and tunnels. They made it all. They blasted the tunnels out of the rock. But they talked about it in medical language. They talked about it as a kind of giant public health measure, that people in New York City were so frazzled, nervous irritation and loss of spirit, and that by walking in this landscape, they would be renewed. Literally a form of sort of national therapy is what that represents. So if you walk in Central Park, think about the tension between our view of nature as the repository of virtue, and then the fact that our economy is based on the kind of exploitation, if not destruction, of nature. And those things are difficult to reconcile. They're as difficult to reconcile as, I think, Jefferson's ideals. Remember, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And the fact that he owned 666 people in his lifetime. He was unable to reconcile those things. Many of us are unable to reconcile our ethics and our beliefs with what we really do during the day. So Olmsted also, we think of him as this landscape architect, but he also invented, or if not invented,